I think it's about time that we head back to our user interface document and start styling it up so we can get to a finished product. For those of you who have been following along the whole time, you should have a document that looks something like this, with our outline and our image masked into the circle in the middle. If you're not all caught up on that, I'll provide you with this document so you can pick up directly from here and you can start styling along with us. The first thing I want to talk about are fills and borders, because most of our design is going to consist of images or shapes that are filled with a color, and some of them will have simple borders around them. And between those two things, that'll make up, honestly, probably 90% or more of the surface area of our entire user interface. So let's start with fills. If you get a shape selected, like our bar across the top here, you'll find your fills on the inspector on the right-hand side. Now, fill has a few aspects to it. There's the fill color, there's the blending mode, which we'll talk about in the next tutorial, and there is opacity, which we'll talk about along with blend mode. The first thing I want to focus on is above the word fill. We have a little color swatch here. It's currently gray, and when we click on it, we get our color picker. And we can pick from any color in the whole color wheel. So we've got our spectrum of hue and saturation. As we go toward the top, we increase brightness. As we go to the right, we increase saturation. And with that, at the bottom, underneath, I've got HSB for hue, saturation, and brightness. And if you guys see RGB instead of HSB, you can hold the Shift key and you can click on those letters to toggle back and forth. So there are two modes here. RGB is red, green, and blue, and the mixture thereof, whereas HSB is hue, saturation, and brightness. Now, technically, if you're working with the color spectrum up here, you're working with HSB, because we've got a slider down here that allows us to change the hue. You can see as I drag from left to right, the H is changing. And then the spectrum up here is saturation and brightness, brightness being up and down, saturation again being left and right. So let's find our hue of blue, and let's find ourselves a nice bright blue. And you'll notice when you select a color, you also get this hex code. Every color has a hex code, so if you're trying to communicate with other designers, or more importantly, if you just want to save a color for yourself and you want to remember to use that exact color, the hex code is the way you're going to get back to exactly the same color in the future. Another way to save a color for later, if you plan on using it in the future, is at the bottom here, we've got these preset swatches and a little plus sign. And if you click on that little plus sign, you can save a color for yourself for future use. Now, on my computer, my dock is getting in the way, and for those of you who are having the same problem, you can hold Option and Command on your keyboard and hit the letter D for dock, and the dock will hide out of the way. When you need the dock, you can move the cursor to the bottom, and the dock will pop back up. So for those of you who aren't familiar with hiding the dock, it could be a good idea. Or you can grab the little separator on the dock that's near your trash can, and you can drag that up or down to increase or decrease the size of the dock. I'm going to decrease the size of my dock so it's out of the way of my color picker. Another way to grab a color, whether you've created the color or not, is using this little eyedropper tool. This eyedropper tool is a way to steal a color from the screen. When you click on it, your cursor turns into a magnifying glass, and wherever you go and whatever you click on, you can just steal the color from it, from anywhere on the screen. That includes outside of Sketch. I could even come down here and I could steal the red color from the iTunes icon down there at the bottom. But all of this that we've done so far is just a solid color fill. The solid color fill is one of several types of fills that we have to choose from. It's the first on the bar across the top above our color spectrum. To the right of it, just to the right of it, the second choice is the gradient tool. And with the gradient tool, it presumes that we want to do a linear gradient. That's a gradient that goes from one point to another point. And with that, we get to set different colors, and it automatically graduates or transitions from one color to the other. So I'll do a really obvious transition here from red to green. And you can see on my object here that that transition is taking place. It also shows the points of the transition on the object itself, and I can click and drag to change the angle of that gradient. I can also click and drag to expand the gradient beyond the visual area of the shape. That'll allow me to do sort of a more gradual, more subtle gradient. And then I'm also able to click in the middle of the line that separates those 2 points to add additional points, and I can add additional colors and really change the appearance of this gradient drastically. I can also add points on the gradient spectrum that's above my color spectrum, and in doing that, it's the same effect, except I might have a little more room to do that up here versus doing it on the object if the object is small. I'm going to click and delete a few of these points that I've made here because I don't need that many points on my gradient. And then I'm going to move over to the very next button after the gradient, which is the radial gradient. It's still a gradient. It's just a different type of gradient. And we're going to be using that shortly because we're going to be filling in the shape at the bottom with a radial gradient to give it a sense of light, to give it a more material look and feel. So this radial gradient works essentially the same way, except the radius is a new option that we have. We can click and drag to expand the radius and the shape of our radial gradient. So the idea of a radial gradient is it's a gradient that goes outward from a center point in 360 degrees, and you can move that, reposition that, and size that. More on that in a bit because we're actually going to be using that. The next one is another type of gradient referred to by Sketch as an angular gradient, and the angular gradient goes around like a clock. We're not going to be using an angular gradient for this tutorial, but it is not a bad way to create a metal sort of texture. So if I do all points of sort of grayish, and I add a couple of more points in here, I'll do like a darker point there, I'll do a lighter point here, and another sort of darker point here. It creates sort of that aluminum effect. So that's one use for that particular type of gradient. Now the next one is to do an image fill. And with an image fill, you can do a pattern, you can do a texture, you get to choose which image you want to fill it with, and that image is going to come from your own computer. We're not going to be using any sort of patterns and textures. We're doing a very flat design here today. But this is one way to give some organic texture or geometric texture to your design. And you also get some preset textures down here at the bottom. They've given us sort of a leather texture. They've given us sort of an eroded texture, a paper texture, along with a crosshatch and a bunch of diagonal lines. These can be very useful for backgrounds and things like that. And then lastly, we have the noise. And with the noise fill, you'll notice it got rid of our color fill. It seems that we can choose between noise or a color. And you might want to have a color with a slight texture to it. And you may remember going back to our Boolean operations video that in that video there was a football, and that football was on a slightly textured green grass. Now that was done using the noise. The slight texture that I got was done using the noise. But how did I have green and noise at the same time? Now this is one of the best things about Sketch. We can have multiple fills, and we can arrange those fills and combine those fills with one another. You'll notice to the right of fills there's a plus sign. And when I click on that plus sign, I can create a second fill for myself. So I can create a color, and then you'll notice that that color is on top of the noise. I can click and drag to rearrange these, and I can put the noise on top of the color. And you'll notice now that that texture is on top of my color. So using multiple fills, we can combine gradients, we can combine colors. We could do something like picking a color fill and then throwing a gradient on top of it in order to lighten or darken the top or bottom. And that way, if we want to change the color, we can just change the solid color fill. We don't have to go and mess with the gradient. The gradient's just going to be used to lighten or darken it, which we're actually going to do momentarily on our bar at the bottom. The other thing you'll notice is I unchecked my noise fill here, and if I don't want that anymore, if that was experimental or if I've changed my mind about it, when you uncheck a fill or a border or a shadow, any one of these items down here, once it's unchecked, there's a little trash can that appears that will allow you to get rid of it. So first turn it off, then click the trash can, and it's out of there. So let's pick a color fill that's going to be more permanent for this bar up here. I'm going to go back to my bluish hue, and we'll go with a color like that. And if you guys want to replicate exactly the same color, the hex code is 44CDDF.